first time I saw the man in the window, I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I was taking the trash out to the curb. The house across the street had been empty for years. A faded for sale sign leaned at an awkward angle in the overgrown yard, and the windows were perpetually dark. So when I glanced up and saw the silhouette, a tall figure, motionless against the dim glow of the street lamp, I froze for a moment, caught off guard. I figured maybe someone had finally bought the place. Or maybe a realtor was checking on it, though the idea of anyone lingering there after dark felt odd. Still, it wasn't my business. I shoved the trash bag into the can and rolled it to the edge of the driveway, keeping my back to the house longer than necessary. When I finally turned back, the figure was gone. By the time I got inside, I'd all but convinced myself I imagined it. The flicker of a curtain. A shadow cast by a tree. But later, when I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of a person standing perfectly still, watching. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on the house. It became a kind of game. I'd glance up when I was getting the mail or pretend to adjust my jacket while sneaking a look as I walked to my car. During the day, there was nothing to see. Just the same peeling paint, the warped shutters, the unkempt yard that hadn't been touched in years. But at night, the figure would appear again. The second time, I was walking my dog, Daisy. We were nearing the end of the block when she stopped suddenly, ears perked and tail stiff, her gaze fixed on the house across the street, and when I followed it, I saw him. Standing in the same spot as before, just behind the window. He was backlit by that faint street lamp glow, his outline sharp and unmistakable. Daisy let out a low growl, something she almost never did. I tugged at her leash, but she didn't budge. "Come on," I muttered, pulling harder. Her growl deepened, a sound that sent an involuntary shiver through me. The figure didn't move, not even a flinch. I stared at him for a beat too long, the air growing colder around me. Finally, I yanked Daisy hard enough to get her moving, and we hurried back home. Even then, I couldn't resist one last look over my shoulder. He was still there. After that, it became impossible to ignore. Every night, without fail, he'd be there, watching, always in the same window, always perfectly still. I started to feel him even when I wasn't looking. A prickling at the back of my neck when I stepped outside after dark. A creeping sense of unease that followed me back to my door. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe he was just some weirdo. Plenty of those around. But something about the house made it worse. It didn't make sense for anyone to be living there, not after how long it had been abandoned. I didn't see any cars in the driveway, no lights flicking on and off inside, no sign of life during the day, just the man in the window at night. One evening I decided to test something. I stood at my front door, curtains drawn just enough to peek through. From that angle, I could see his window clearly. As soon as it got dark, he was there. His silhouette was unmistakable, the rigid posture, the faint outline of his face turned toward me. I lifted my phone and snapped a picture. The screen flashed, and for a split second, my heart stopped. The figure in the window moved. A flicker of motion, subtle but undeniable. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. Then, just as quickly as it started, he went still again. When I looked down at my phone, my stomach dropped. The picture was black, no window, no silhouette, just darkness. I took another shot, angling the camera toward the exact spot I was looking at. Same result. It was as if he wasn't there at all. That night, I barely slept. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, the faint shift of his outline, the empty photographs. My rational mind kept trying to explain it away. Maybe the light from the street lamp wasn't strong enough, or there was a smudge on my camera lens. But no matter how many excuses I came up with, they didn't feel right. The next morning, I decided to confront it head-on. I walked across the street to the house, ignoring the twinge of anxiety clawing at my gut. Up close, it looked even worse than it did from a distance. The grass was knee-high, sprouting wild and uneven. The paint had chipped away almost completely, leaving behind patches of exposed wood. The air around the place felt heavy, as if it was holding its breath. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath my weight. There was no doorbell, just a rusted metal knocker shaped like a lion's head. I raised my hand to use it, but hesitated. What was I even going to say? that I thought someone was watching me from the window, that I wanted to know why my photos didn't come out. It all sounded absurd. Still, I knocked. The sound echoed faintly, swallowed by the empty street. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. No answer. Finally, I tried the doorknob. It was locked. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the door, straining to hear anything: footsteps, breathing, movement. All I heard was silence. I backed away, uneasy. As I stepped off the porch, I glanced up at the window where I always saw him. It was empty. That should have been the end of it. I should have let it go, stopped looking. But something about the house and its unmoving occupant gnawed at me. I became obsessed. Every night, I'd sit by my window, staring out at his. I'd set up cameras, hoping to catch some proof of what I was seeing. I'd scour the internet for any record of the property, trying to figure out who owned it or if anyone had ever lived there. The cameras didn't help. Each time I reviewed the footage, the house was empty, just a still frame of that decaying facade, the window blank and lifeless. But when I looked with my own eyes, there he was, watching me. The searches didn't lead anywhere, either. The house didn't have a clear owner. It had been listed on and off over the years, but every sale fell through for reasons that weren't documented. No one had lived there, at least not officially, in decades. The deeper I dug, the stranger it got. The more I searched for answers, the more I felt like I was tugging at a thread that would unravel something I couldn't put back together. I should have stopped. Any reasonable person would have, but by then it was too late for reason. I needed to know who or what was standing in that window every night, staring at me. About a week after I first knocked on the door, I decided to try again. This time I went in the middle of the night. If someone was in there, they'd be harder to miss. Armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I crossed the street and slipped into the yard. The grass felt damp against my ankles, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Up close, the house looked even more foreboding under the moonlight. I kept my steps light as I climbed the porch, trying to avoid making the wood creak. When I reached the door, I hesitated again. My hand hovered over the knocker, but I couldn't bring myself to use it. Not this time. Instead, I tried the doorknob again. To my surprise, it turned. The lock must have been broken or left undone, though I could have sworn it was secure before. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a dark and cavernous interior. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air inside was stagnant, tinged with the metallic bite of rust and decay. The living room looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Furniture was covered in dusty sheets and cobwebs draped from the corners of the ceiling. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, revealing rotted plaster beneath. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello, is anyone here?" The house swallowed the sound, leaving me with only the soft hum of my own breathing. I shone my flashlight toward the window where I'd seen the figure. From this angle, it looked like any ordinary window. No signs of anyone standing there, no marks on the floorboards, just empty space. But I knew better. I'd seen him there night after night. He couldn't have just vanished. I ventured deeper into the house. The kitchen was next, its counters littered with yellowed newspapers and rusted utensils. A faint drip echoed from somewhere unseen, the sound sharp and uneven. Each step I took felt heavier, the weight of the house pressing down on me. Then I found the stairs. They led up into darkness, the kind that seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight. I hesitated again, but something compelled me forward. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was that gnawing need for answers. Or maybe it was the faint, almost imperceptible sound of movement, like the shuffle of feet coming from somewhere above. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step a protest. I kept my light trained ahead, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. At the top, the hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with closed doors. The air was colder up here, almost icy. I turned to the left, following the source of the sound. The second door on the right was slightly ajar. A faint beam of moonlight filtered through the crack, painting a thin line across the floor. I approached slowly, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. With a shaky hand, I pushed the door open, The room was empty. Dust motes floated lazily in the moonlight, and the floor was bare except for a few scattered leaves that must have blown in through a broken window. But as I stood there, something felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I saw it. The closet door, barely visible in the shadows, was slightly open. A thin sliver of darkness beckoned from within. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought I could prove to myself that it was nothing, that this whole thing was just in my head. I stepped forward, my pulse roaring in my ears. My hand reached for the closet door, trembling. Before I could touch it, the door swung open on its own. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. It spun wildly, its beam slicing across the room. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a shape, tall and angular, retreating deeper into the shadows. Then the flashlight went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for it, my fingers scrabbling against the floorboards. When I finally found it and clicked it back on, the room was empty again. The closet door stood wide open, revealing only darkness inside. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had been there. I left the house after that, practically sprinting across the street to the safety of my own home. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I locked the door behind me, bolting it for good measure. I stood there for a long time, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. That night, I didn't look out the window. I couldn't bring myself to. But I didn't need to. I could feel him watching. If I had stopped then, if I had ignored the way the house seemed to pulse with its own life, the way I could feel his gaze on me, even when I wasn't looking, maybe things would have been different. But I couldn't let it go. I told myself I just needed to understand, that finding answers would make it stop. I couldn't have been more wrong. The next few nights I didn't sleep much. Every creak of my house, every whisper of wind outside made me jump. But the worst part was the window. Even though I avoided looking at it directly, I could sense the figure there. I didn't need to see him to know he was standing in the same place, watching. On the third night, something changed. I had fallen into a restless sleep, my body finally giving in to exhaustion. I woke with a jolt, my heart pounding, though I couldn't remember what had startled me. For a moment I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my breathing. That's when I noticed the faint sound of footsteps outside my window. They were slow and deliberate, crunching softly against the gravel of my driveway. My throat tightened, and I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. The steps stopped just below my bedroom window. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then I heard a faint tap against the glass, soft but insistent. My body locked up. I didn't want to look. I couldn't. But the tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like a metronome counting down. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I turned my head. At first I didn't see anything. The streetlight cast long shadows across the yard, and the glass reflected my own terrified face back at me. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw him. He was standing just outside the window, his face inches from the glass. He was even taller than I'd imagined, his shoulders impossibly broad, his features obscured by shadow. But his eyes, those I could see clearly. They were pale and luminous, fixed on me with a cold, unwavering intensity. I scrambled backward, nearly falling off the bed. The tapping stopped, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching, as if waiting for something. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Would they even believe me? I didn't know what to do. All I could think about was getting away. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the window. The light caught his face, or what I thought was his face, and for a split second, I wished I hadn't looked. It wasn't just shadow obscuring his features. There was something wrong with him, something off. His skin was pale and taut, almost translucent, and his mouth was stretched into a grim, unnatural line. Then, just as quickly as I saw him, he was gone. I don't mean he ran away. He didn't step back or move to the side. One moment he was there, and the next he wasn't. Like he'd never been there at all. I stayed awake until dawn, every light in the house blazing. When the sun finally rose, I ventured outside. My driveway was empty. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I'd seen. That morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I didn't care if I was overreacting or if I sounded crazy. I wasn't spending another night in that house. I packed a bag and called my brother, asking if I could stay with him for a while. He didn't ask many questions, just said I could crash on his couch as long as I needed. I didn't tell him everything, just that something strange was going on in my neighborhood, and I wanted to get away for a bit. He offered to come over and help me pack, but I declined. I didn't want him getting involved. Whatever was happening, it was tied to that house and to me. By the time evening rolled around, I was almost ready to leave. I had my bag packed and sitting by the door, my car keys in hand. All I had to do was lock up and go. But as I reached for the door, something stopped me. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like a pull, a magnetic force that drew me toward the window. I didn't want to look, but my body moved on its own, as if some unseen hand was guiding me. When I reached the window, I saw him again. He was back in his usual spot, standing in the window across the street. But this time, something was different. He wasn't alone. There was another figure beside him. Smaller, slighter, but just as still. At first I thought it was another man, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a child. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, with the same pale, luminous eyes. He stood at the man's side, their gazes locked on me. And then they moved. It wasn't a natural motion. They didn't walk or turn. They just shifted, like a flickering image on a faulty screen. One moment they were in the window, and the next they were closer. Standing in the front yard of the house, side by side, their faces turned toward me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and ran to my car. As I sped away, I couldn't bring myself to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to know if they were following. I made it to my brother's place that night, shaking and exhausted. But even as I sat in the safety of his living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. That somehow, no matter where I went, they'd find me. And when I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of the man and the boy standing in the shadows, waiting. If anything, leaving my house only made it worse. At first, staying with my brother gave me a false sense of security. His place was in a busy part of town, far removed from the quiet, desolate street where the house stood. For a while, I even managed to convince myself that whatever I had seen was tied to that place alone. I told myself that if I stayed away, it couldn't reach me. I was wrong. The first sign came a few days after I moved in. My brother left early for work, and I had the place to myself. I was making coffee in the kitchen, trying to distract myself with the routine of it, when I felt it again, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The feeling that I was being watched. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter. Slowly, I turned to look out the window above the sink. At first, I didn't see anything, just the parking lot behind my brother's building and the row of dumpsters along the far wall. But then, in the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. I focused on it, my heart sinking. Across the lot, standing in the shadow of the dumpsters, was the man from the window. He wasn't in a house this time. There was no glass between us, no barriers. Just him, standing perfectly still, his pale eyes fixed on me. I dropped the coffee mug. It shattered against the tile floor, but I barely noticed. My legs felt rooted in place, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He didn't move, didn't react. He just stood there, watching. I forced myself to back away from the window, keeping my eyes on him the entire time. When I reached the living room, I grabbed my phone and called my brother. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. He picked up after the third ring. "What's up?" "Someone's outside," I blurted, my voice trembling. "In the parking lot. I think he followed me." What his voice sharpened. "Are you serious? Did you call the police?" I hadn't even thought of that. No, not yet. "Okay, stay inside. Lock the doors. I'm coming home." The line went dead, and I stood there, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline. My brother worked across town. It would take him at least 20 minutes to get back. In the meantime, I locked every door and window in the apartment, double-checking each one to make sure it was secure. When I finally worked up the nerve to look out the kitchen window again, he was gone. The space where he'd been standing was empty, the shadow of the dumpsters undisturbed. For a moment I wondered if I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew better. My brother arrived not long after, bursting through the door with a baseball bat in hand. He searched the parking lot and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the man. He came back looking frustrated and more than a little skeptical. "Are you sure you saw someone?" he asked. "There's no one out there." "I'm sure," I said, though my voice sounded weak even to me. "He was standing right there." My brother sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I believe you think you saw something, but maybe it was just a guy passing through. A homeless guy or something. It doesn't mean he followed you." I didn't argue. What was the point? He wouldn't understand. No one would. But that night, as I lay awake on the couch, I kept seeing the man's face in my mind. His pale eyes, his expressionless stare. He hadn't been passing through. He'd been waiting. The days that followed were worse. I started seeing him everywhere. Not always clearly, not always for long. A flicker of movement outside the window. A tall figure standing at the end of the hall in my brother's building. Always watching, always silent. And it wasn't just him anymore. The boy was there too. I'd catch glimpses of him in reflections, his small form hovering just out of reach. It wasn't long before my brother started to notice that something was wrong. I wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating. I jumped at every noise, every shadow. Finally, one night, he confronted me. "You need to tell me what's going on," he said. "The truth this time." I hesitated, my mind racing. I wanted to tell him everything, to unload the weight of it all. But I knew how it would sound. Crazy. Impossible. Still, I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. "It's the house," I said finally. "The one across the street from mine. There's someone there. A man and a boy. They're watching me." He frowned. "You mean they were watching you? You're not even there anymore." I shook my head. "No, they're still watching. They followed me." His expression shifted, concern giving way to disbelief. "Followed you? That's... How? Why would they?" "I don't know," I snapped, my voice cracking. "I don't know what they want. But they're not normal. They're not human." The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. My brother stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he didn't know what to say. "Maybe you need to talk to someone," he said eventually. "A therapist or..." "I'm not crazy," I interrupted. "I know what I saw." He didn't argue, but the look on his face said enough. He didn't believe me. And why would he? None of it made sense. That night, I decided I couldn't stay at my brother's place any longer. I didn't want to drag him into whatever this was. If they were following me, I needed to face it alone. But as I packed my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. That no matter where I went, they would always find me. By the time I decided to leave my brother's place, I wasn't sure where I could go that they wouldn't follow. The idea of going back to my house felt insane. I'd barely escaped that suffocating sense of being watched, but I didn't have many options. Every moment I spent in my brother's apartment felt like tempting fate. I was sure that if I stayed, something terrible would happen, something I couldn't stop. I left just before dawn, throwing my bag into the trunk of my car and driving aimlessly for hours. The city blurred past me, then gave way to long stretches of highway, empty fields and dense woods. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed distance. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling lingered. That itch on the back of my neck. That subtle pull, like something was tethering me to them. I checked my rearview mirror constantly, expecting to see the man or the boy sitting in the back seat. They never were, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Eventually, I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of a small town I didn't recognize. It was the kind of place where the paint was peeling, and the parking lot was half empty even in the middle of the day. Perfect for disappearing, I thought. The clerk barely looked up as he handed me a key, and I was grateful for his disinterest. My room was at the far end of the building, overlooking a patch of woods that stretched endlessly into the horizon. I locked the door behind me, shoved a chair under the knob, and closed the blinds. For the first time in what felt like days, I allowed myself to breathe. The relief was short-lived. That night, as I lay in the lumpy motel bed, I heard it again, the soft, deliberate tap against the window. I sat up, my heart racing. The blinds were closed, but the sound came again, 3 quick taps, followed by silence. I didn't move at first, paralyzed by fear. I wanted to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. But deep down I knew better. The taps came again, louder this time, almost impatient. Slowly I slid out of bed and crept toward the window. My fingers shook as I reached for the cord to blinds aside. For a moment I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to see what was out there. But the taps came again, and this time they didn't stop. A steady rhythm that sent ice through my veins. I yanked the cord. At first I thought the window was empty, but then my eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw him. The man was standing just beyond the glass, his pale eyes meeting mine. He was so close I could see the faint lines etched into his skin, the unnatural smoothness of his expression. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared. Behind him, half hidden in the shadows of the woods, was the boy. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his hands hanging limply at his sides. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, as if something in the room had caught his attention. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair I'd shoved under the door. My mind raced. They'd found me. They'd followed me here, just like I'd feared. And now they weren't waiting anymore. They were coming closer. The tapping stopped. The man raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. His fingers were long and spindly, the skin stretched too tight. For a moment I thought he was going to break the window. But then he lowered his hand and stepped back into the darkness. The boy followed. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching a lamp like it could protect me, and waited for morning. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the blinds, I packed my bag and left without looking back. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to keep moving. For the next week, I drifted from place to place. Cheap motels, rest stops, anywhere that felt like it would buy me a few hours of peace. But no matter where I went, they found me. They didn't always show themselves, but I could feel them. I'd catch glimpses of them in reflections or hear faint footsteps outside my door at night. And every time I thought I was safe, the tapping would start again. It didn't matter how far I ran. They were always there, waiting, watching. By the time I realized what I had to do, I was too exhausted to be afraid anymore. If they wanted me, I would face them. I had to go back, to the house, to where it had all started. Maybe then I could end it. I drove through the night, the miles blurring into a haze of headlights and darkened landscapes. When I finally pulled onto my old street, the house was just as I'd left it, dark, decaying and silent. But this time it felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. It was like the house was waiting for me. I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling, and approached the front door. It was already open, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the darkness swallowed everything, but I didn't need a flashlight to know where I was going. The window. I walked through the empty halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house seemed alive around me, groaning and creaking with every movement. When I reached the living room, I stopped. The window was there, just as I remembered it. And standing in front of it, silhouetted against the faint glow of the street lamp, was the man. He turned slowly, his movements fluid and unnatural. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw something in them: recognition. He raised one hand, beckoning me forward. Behind him, the boy stepped out of the shadows. His head tilted again, his pale eyes unblinking. They were waiting for me, and for the first time I felt the pull of the house. A strange, undeniable force that urged me to step closer. And so I did. A part of me, the rational part, screamed at me to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But the pull was stronger. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper, something primal. It was as though the house itself was alive, whispering to me in a language I couldn't understand but couldn't resist. As I stepped closer to the man and the boy, I felt the air around me grow colder. The room seemed to stretch and warp, the shadows on the walls twisting into unnatural shapes. The man didn't move. He just watched, his hands still outstretched, his fingers long and impossibly still. The boy mirrored him, tilting his head further, his pale eyes reflecting the faint light, like a cat's. When I was only a few feet away, the man finally spoke. "Why did you come back?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. My voice cracked, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "I want to know what you want from me." The man tilted his head, mimicking the boy. His pale eyes bore into mine, unblinking. "We didn't come for you." I froze, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing the window behind him. The boy followed, moving in perfect synchrony. They stood on either side of the glass, framing it like sentinels. I hesitated, but the pull was stronger now, dragging me toward the window. When I reached it, I looked out. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the street, quiet and empty under the dim glow of the street lamp. But as I stared, the world outside began to shift. The streetlight flickered, casting strange, stuttering shadows across the pavement. The houses warped and blurred, their edges bleeding into the darkness. And then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the light. They were like the man and the boy, pale, still, and unnervingly silent. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, fixed on the house. On me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. "Who are they?" "They are waiting," the man said, his voice impossibly calm. For what I demanded, my voice rising in panic. "What do they want?" The boy finally spoke then, his voice high and eerily melodic. "They want what was taken." "What does that mean?" I shouted, my frustration and fear boiling over. "What was taken? Who are you?" The man stepped forward, his expression unchanging. "You should not have come back." The lights in the house flickered, and the air grew colder still. I felt something brush against my arm, light, fleeting, but undeniably real. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The house groaned, its walls seeming to close in around me. I turned back to the man and the boy, but they were gone. The window was empty, its glass fogged with condensation that hadn't been there before. The figures outside had moved closer, their glowing eyes now just beyond the glass. I ran. I didn't look back, I just ran. The house seemed to fight me with every step, the floorboards creaking and shifting beneath my feet. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the front door retreating further and further away. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tight with panic. When I finally reached the door, I threw it open and stumbled outside. The night air hit me like a slap, sharp and freezing. I turned to look back at the house, but it was dark and lifeless again, the window empty. I got into my car and drove without thinking, the engine roaring as I tore down the street. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I know it's not over. The pull is still there, faint but constant, like a thread wrapped around my soul. The figures from the window haunt my dreams, their pale eyes watching from the darkness. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of tapping on my window. "They didn't come for me," the man said. "But they're not done with me either. I don't think they ever will be." I wish it could end, that I could put a period on the story and say, "That's it. I escaped, but some things don't let go. They don't allow you to walk away, even when you run as far and as fast as you can. They linger, waiting for a crack to slip through." I thought driving until sunrise would be enough. The daylight would break the hold the house had on me, scatter the shadows, and free me. But when the sun came up, the world didn't feel any safer. Instead, the light seemed wrong, too thin, too pale. The shadows it cast on the highway stretched too far, and sometimes they moved when nothing should have caused them to. The first time I saw him again after leaving the house, I was parked at a diner off the interstate. I'd pulled over for a quick meal, thinking maybe some normalcy would ground me. Inside, the place was a time capsule of greasy counters, cracked vinyl booths, and an overworked waitress who barely glanced at me as I slid into a seat by the window. I hadn't eaten in hours, but the thought of food made my stomach churn. Instead, I sat with a cup of coffee, watching the trucks roll by on the highway. That's when I saw him. The man, standing across the lot near the edge of the woods. He wasn't hiding or pretending to be part of the background. He wanted me to see him. This time I didn't freeze. I grabbed my keys, tossed a crumpled bill onto the counter, and headed for the door. I thought if I confronted him, if I demanded answers face to face, I might be able to end this nightmare once and for all. But when I stepped outside, he was gone. I spun around, searching the edges of the parking lot, the nearby trees, even the spaces between the parked cars. Nothing. But I knew better than to believe he had truly disappeared. He was waiting, always waiting. That night, I stopped at another motel, one of those chain places where the carpets are thin and the doors barely lock. I told myself I just needed sleep, that the exhaustion was feeding my paranoia. But as soon as I lay down, the whispers began. They weren't loud, just faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first I thought they were part of a dream, something dredged up by my exhausted mind. But when I sat up, the whispers continued, soft and rhythmic. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out the words, but they didn't make sense. They were in a language I didn't understand, a guttural, clicking cadence that sent shivers down my spine. I backed away, my pulse racing. Then the tapping started. It came from the window, the same 3 deliberate taps I'd heard before. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look. The blinds were closed, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the glass. The tapping came again, louder this time, almost urgent. I didn't open the blinds. I didn't need to. I already knew who it was. Instead, I grabbed my bag and bolted, leaving the room key on the nightstand. I didn't care about the money I'd wasted on the room or the stares from the night clerk as I sped out of the parking lot. I just needed to get away. But I couldn't outrun them. The man, the boy, the house, they were always there, just at the edges of my vision, waiting for me to slip up, to give in. And I knew I was running out of time. I started to piece things together, or at least I tried to. I went back over everything I'd learned about the house, the figures, the strange whispers. I spent hours in libraries and on the internet, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. There were stories, of course. Legends of cursed places, of shadowy figures that marked their prey and followed them relentlessly. But none of them felt quite right. Then I found something. It was an old newspaper article, buried in an archive I almost missed. The headline read, "Family vanishes from local home, foul play suspected." The date was decades old, but the address was the same, the house across the street from mine. The article was sparse on details. A family of 3 had lived there, a man, his wife, and their young son. One night they disappeared without a trace. The neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the days leading up to their disappearance, whispers, footsteps, tapping at their windows. The police found no evidence of a break-in, no signs of a struggle, just an empty house and a lingering sense of unease. The case was never solved. I stared at the article for a long time, my mind racing. The boy, the man, could they be? No, it didn't make sense. The man I'd seen wasn't old enough to be the father. And the boy, there was something about him that didn't feel human at all. But if they weren't the family, what were they? And why had they chosen me? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't keep running. If I did, they'd follow me forever, until I broke or until they finally caught up. I had to end it. And there was only one way to do that. I had to go back to the house. It was the beginning of the darkest stretch of the journey, the part where survival meant stepping straight into the trap instead of running from it. I didn't want to go back to the house. Every fiber of my being screamed against the idea. But it had become clear that there was no other way. They had chosen me, and until I faced them on their terms, I would never be free. I drove through the night, my stomach a tight knot of dread. The town came into view just as the first light of dawn bled into the sky. My street was eerily quiet, every house dark and still. The house across from mine stood like a waiting predator, its facade blank and decaying, its presence heavier than ever. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. My eyes were fixed on the window, but it was empty. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The emptiness felt worse somehow, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar from the trunk, though I doubted either would help if things went south. The air was cold and still as I crossed the street, my footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. The front door hung slightly ajar, just as it had the last time I'd been here. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a pungent mix of mildew, rot, and something metallic. The house felt alive, its walls seeming to pulse faintly in the dim light. I moved through the rooms, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Everything was just as I remembered it, the dust-covered furniture, the peeling wallpaper, the oppressive silence. I made my way to the living room, to the window where I'd first seen the man. The glass was fogged, obscuring the view outside. I reached out to wipe it clean, but as my hand neared the pane, the fog shifted. It wasn't condensation, it was moving, writhing like smoke trapped behind the glass. I pulled my hand back, my pulse quickening. "They're not here," a voice said behind me. I spun around, the crowbar raised. The man was standing in the doorway, his pale eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The boy was at his side, his head tilted at that unnatural angle, his expression unreadable. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements fluid and deliberate. "You came back," he said. "That is enough." Enough for what? I took a step back, gripping the crowbar tighter. "To see," he said simply. "To understand." Before I could respond, the boy moved. He didn't walk, he glided, his feet barely touching the ground. He stopped in front of me, his pale eyes locking onto mine. For a moment I was frozen, unable to look away. Then the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint ripple, like a reflection in water. But it grew stronger, the walls warping and stretching as though the house was breathing. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic tang of blood. Shadows pooled in the corners, spilling out across the floor like ink. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering. "What's happening?" The man and the boy didn't answer. They stood perfectly still, their forms dark against the twisting reality around them. The shadows reached for me, curling around my legs like tendrils. I swung the crowbar at them, but it passed through harmlessly, as though they weren't there. The house groaned, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the walls. The shadows thickened, climbing up my body, pulling me toward the window. I fought against them, but it was like trying to fight the tide. The fogged glass loomed closer and closer, until my face was almost pressed against it. And then I saw. The glass cleared, revealing a scene that wasn't my street, wasn't anything I recognized. It was a void, an endless expanse of black and gray, dotted with faint, glowing shapes. Figures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, standing in the darkness, their pale eyes fixed on me. They weren't human. They couldn't be. Their forms were distorted, their limbs too long, their faces too smooth. They watched silently, unmoving, their presence oppressive and overwhelming. And in the center of them stood the man and the boy. They weren't standing with me anymore, they were there, inside the void, part of it. The man raised his hand, beckoning me forward, his expression calm and unyielding. "Why?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, over the roaring in my ears. "To take your place," he said. The shadows surged, pulling me closer to the window. I screamed, swinging the crowbar wildly, but it was useless. The glass began to ripple like water, and I felt myself being drawn into it, the cold seeping into my skin. At the last moment, I turned my head, my eyes locking onto the boy. For the first time, his expression changed. He looked sad, regretful. His lips parted, and I thought he might speak. But then the shadows closed around me, and everything went black. I woke up on the floor of my house, the sunlight streaming through the windows. At first I thought it had been a dream, some vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But when I sat up, I saw the bruises on my arms, the faint imprint of fingers that weren't mine. The house across the street was empty again. No man, no boy, just a silent, decaying shell. But at night, I feel them. Watching me, waiting. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I don't recognize the eyes staring back at me. It isn't over. It never will be.